up?
Hey, good.
Yo, what's up, guys?
Yo, so you guys ready for the Gyeongbok Palace, yo?
Yeah, man, let's do it.
Man, I'm excited. Alright, let's go.
Hey, guys, so I think for history, I got us. Let me show you guys what I got.
Alright.
In the pre-colonial time, the Gyeongbok Palace was constructed in Hanyang in 1395 under the Joseon dynasty. He declared Hanyang the capital of his empire, and the building was erected henceforth. The palace was in ruins after the Japanese invasion in 1592 and remained ruined for 2 centuries. Because of the financial burden, it was difficult for preceding rulers to rebuild the building until King Gyeongbok in 1865. King Gyeongbok built the entire palace in order to restore the glory of the dynasty. An axis from north extending to the south of the building was the axis that was used for minister buildings, which were built on either side, known as the axis of Seoul. So, in the colonial era, this triumph was short-lived as the Japanese invasion and the era of colonization from 1910 to 1945. During their reign, most of the buildings of the Gyeongbok Palace complex were demolished. The second gate of the Gyeongbok Palace was destroyed, as you can see here, to make room for the Japanese general building. The JGB, built in 1926, which signified a defeat for Koreans. The JGB was built towering over the Gyeongbok Palace that signified a lot of nationalism and identity to Koreans. Author Choi explains, the goal of the Japanese was to shatter the spirit of the Koreans by towering over the ruins of the palace in the heart of Seoul. So now, on to post-colonial era. The JGB was not destroyed until 1995 and served as a Korean government building and the National Museum of Korea before it was demolished. The attitude towards its demolition was one that was shared among most of the Korean population. In contrast, the Gyeongbok Palace brought back a sense of attachment to some Koreans. It seemed that the glory of the historical significance was not lost. In 1990, there was an emphasis on rebuilding the palace that was once ruined by the colonial era. A 20-year plan was made to improve the nationalistic pride in Korea. Author blank states, a survey taken by the office of that, 67.5% of the population was in favor of the restoration, 18.2% opposed the project. The restoration sparked some controversy. Some of the conversations that circulated around this topic are the social implications for national identity and historical authenticity. Yo, so which one of you guys did post-colonial desire?
I did, bro.
Nice.
When analyzing the Gyeongbok Palace, it is crucial to look at the location from the lens of Korea's post-colonial desire. Korea's post-colonial desire was primarily centered on creating a shared feeling of national identity and changing the perception of history so that the country can advance further, whether that be economical and socially. With that being said, there are still mixed feelings on the palace and whether or not it did fulfill Korea's post-colonial desire. For example, author Soja Kim, in his article Post-Colonialism and the Restoration of Culture Identity, a study on the recreation of Gyeongbok Palace, discusses the rebuilding of the Gyeongbok Palace. Kim 2017 explains that the main goal of the restoration of the palace was to restore the palace to their original form and remove any signs of disgrace inscribed by the Japanese imperialists. From author Kim's reasoning, one can conclude that rebuilding of the palace in part fulfills Korea's post-colonial desire to create a national identity, because through restoring the palace to its former glory, Korea was trying to restore its history that was disconnected due to Japanese colonial rule. When the palace was restored, it became a source of public education, which showcased that the national identity was destroyed during the Japanese regime.
Hello? Hey guys, it's Arvin. He wants to get on a call.
Hey guys, so yeah, the reason why the palace needed to be restored in the first place was because between the Gyeongbok Palace and the Gwanghwamun Gate during the colonial era, the Japanese had built the Japanese General Government Building, which effectively destroyed a plethora of historical buildings within the palace complex. In the years 1995 to 1996, the JGGB was destroyed and the palace restoration process was underway. The group of individuals that seek to destroy the JGGB and restore the palace view the palace as a national icon that need to be restored in order to provide Korea with a ground on which to build its modern identity. As well, author Choi in his article argued that the restoration of the palace fulfilled Korea's post-colonial desire. This is because the increasing importance of tourism as a factor helped Korea's national progress economically, which in itself helped its post-national desires, as the palace and its restoration proved to boost tourism and help spur Korea's economic growth. But not everyone in Korea agreed with the fact that the palace's restoration process fulfilled Korea's post-colonial desire. So Choi stated that the palace proved much debate owing to its symbolism in Korean society with its historical preservation circle, whereas the individuals that seek to conserve the JGGB did not care to restore the palace, as they saw the site as something that represented a long extinct royal dynasty that failed to protect the country from foreign powers that seek to colonize Korea. This aforementioned group saw the Gyeongbok Palace as a reminder of Korea's downfall in its protecting itself from colonization. From these points, it's evident that there are mixed feelings when it comes to the topic of Gyeongbok Palace's restoration and how it directly correlates with Korea's post-colonial desires for a national identity and continuation of Korean history. So to discuss the topic of nostalgia, I'll be handing it over to Ode.
So does the palace bring back nostalgia? So there are a lot of mixed feelings amongst Koreans about various structures that were built during the colonial period and or those that have lived through it till date. Gyeongbok Palace is one of these structures that has not only lived through the colonial period but was significantly damaged by the Japanese. Due to this long extensive history of the palace, it was now a reminder of the past, which includes the colonial period and also the post-colonial period and the various troubles that Korea had with North Korea in the 20th century. So more than ever, talks took place about how the planned restoration of this palace would bring back the troubled past, or help achieve its post-colonial desire, as talked about Irvin and Sokji earlier. Thus, to answer this question in this part, we analyze and examine what scholars have to say about the palace in general, and if its restoration brought back the troubled past or helped overcome it. Young, journalist and author, argues that the palace and its restoration helps remove some of the nostalgia behind the colonial past, but argues that the restoration may not have been the optimal solution to remove the nostalgia and overcome the past. Young argues that the best way to allow the fear of the past, particularly the colonial past, amongst the Koreans was not to restore the palace, because this restoration led to the demolition of the Japanese created buildings like the JGGB. He offers that instead of the palace being restored, these buildings like the JGBB should have been kept and left to rot in ruins and taken over by grass and weeds, which would bring shame to the Japanese while bringing pride to Koreans and allowing them to overcome the nostalgia surrounded by the troubled past. In contrast, scholar Jung Ning argues that the palace, and particularly its restoration, is a powerful and effective means of getting rid of nostalgia of the colonial period, and the re-emergence of palace's previous structures that were once removed by the Japanese show a sign of resilience. Moreover, the restoration is meant for the destruction of the JGGB, which was one of the most prominent reminders of the past. Similarly, author Sung Lin Hyun also agrees that the restoration also led to the destruction of the National Museum of Korea, which was in the JGGB building, which was a painful reminder of the past and therefore destroyed, thanks to the restoration of the Gyeongbok Palace. Therefore, as for author Jung Jin-ding and Sun Ling Young, the restoration and the palace not only took away flashbacks of the era, but the restoration which led to the destruction of Japanese structures from the colonial era to make room for palace's older structures show that Korea has taken back their land and is overcoming the past stronger than ever before. Based on the above, we also agree with authors Jung Mi Kyo and Sun Lin Yun that indeed the palace in fact does not bring back a nostalgia of the troubled past of Korea, as instead the palace living through the many centuries of history as seen through the Korean War, post-colonial era, and a dictatorship government symbolizes the resilience of Korean people and Koreans to get out of tough times and prosper as they are in the modern century.
William, where are you? Are you at work?
I'm sorry guys that I'm not with you. I'm at work, but don't worry, I did my part.
The museumification of the Gyeongbok Palace.
So a quote from Kim Won-ki, director of the Royal Palace, states, "We believe our restoration project will fuel national pride in the Korean people and contribute to setting our history straight and thereby reinforcing the strength of our nation." Now, from the point of view of the article, the museumification of the Gyeongbok Palace is not to transparently educate the public as to the full history of Korea and the palace, but instead shed light on the beautiful architectures and traditions of the dynasty and to limit traces of Japanese colonialism. In the article made by Indian Journal of Science and Technology, it highlights that the notable evidence backing this argument is the fact that in 1997, the headquarters of the Japanese government general in Korea was demolished completely, eliminating the trace of one of the most significant buildings that represented the comparison of the two powers represented here, Japan and Korea. But here lies the two opinions behind the newly museumized Gyeongbok Palace. Number one being, heritage sites from the colonial era are usually referred to as dark heritage or negative heritage. For them, restoring the royal palace is not to merely a project of restoring cultural heritage, it is restoring national pride and the nation's spirit that was slaughtered by Japan. They're reminded that the Japanese buildings in the palace was a disgrace to the dignity of Korean people. Now, on the other hand, some people argue that these terms are bad, since without considering other tales about the building, they focus on the bad aspect and they don't consider how they were used following the colonial period. Similar to the quote, "Live in the enemy's home until it is mine." The Japanese General Government Building, which housed the country's capital until the early 1980s, and afterwards served as a National Museum of Korea. This means that the structure was being used by the Korean government for a longer period of time than by Imperial Japan. There are two museums located in Gyeongbok Palace, the National Palace Museum of Korea and the National Folk Museum of Korea. So the National Palace Museum of Korea is a museum dedicated to the royal palaces of Korea. It is a two-story museum that gives you a lot of information about the traditions of the royal family and the history of Korea. Now, the National Folk Museum of Korea, it's partially outdoors with exhibits showing old buildings. This museum showcases a lot of the cultural and the folk aspects of Korean culture. It is more of an interactive museum. Now, in addition, people are able to walk around the palaces and stand in front or even in some of the buildings themselves. Families are being guided by tours and able to read about the histories on the outside of these palaces. They can even watch the changing of the guard that occurs on a regular schedule. Now, if we look over to the narratives of different brochures for the Gyeongbok Palace, we can see that the brochure for the official website states that staff of the Gyeongbok Palace office will continue to do its best to preserve and promote the palace, a most illustrious legacy of our ancestors. So they want to educate and represent the legacy of their ancestors, thus promoting what the Japanese colonialism has left. They also mentioned removing multiple Japanese buildings as if it was a good thing, and that it was replaced with what originally there, such as the bedchambers of the king and queen. So this supports the first opinion listed of restoring national pride and the nation's spirit that was slaughtered by Japan. Moving on to the second brochure, this is from a tour guide agency that operates there. So this information brochure explains the uses of the building before, during, and after the demolition. It explained how these buildings were utilized by both the dynasty era as well as how they were used under the control of Japan. This supports the second opinion as they focus on the history before the entry of Japan as well as during their reign. Pass it back to you guys.
Thank you for watching our video.
Don't forget to
Like,
share and subscribe. Hey,
let's go.